I've got a great panel with me today, and I'm going to get them to introduce themselves, starting with Gabe.
Hi, I'm Gabe Madison. I'm Director of Public Relations for Thomson Reuters and have been in that position for about 5 years, but with Thomson Reuters for about 10.
Thank you. Matt?
Thank you, Taylor. My name is Matt Houston. I am an entrepreneur, professor, and an activist in economic development here in Dallas. I am principal of MLH Enterprises, a consulting firm that focuses on economic development, education, and leadership development. And I am also lecturer of management at the School of Business at the University of North Texas at Dallas.
Thank you. Demetra?
Hello, I'm Demetra Brown. I'm the Senior Director with the DEC Network. I serve the Southern Dallas community, in particular here in Redbird. Beyond that, I'm an economic opportunity champion. That means that when it comes to economic mobility and closing the generational gap in terms of wealth, that's where my interest and passion lie.
Thank you so much. And as always, Tom.
Yeah, well, thank you, Matt, Gabe, and Demetra for joining us. My name is Tom Foley. I am a facilitator for the Culture Roundtable. We're trying to drive these convo actions where we take the conversations and turn them into action. Excited about today's conversation. Part of my role is also teaching entrepreneurship at Paul Quinn as we focus on the impact to the community and what we can do to drive greater impact for the community. I'm interested to lend that perspective and certainly hear from Matt, Demetra, and Gabe, so thank you.
Thanks so much for joining us today, guys. We're going to kick this off with kind of a personal question. We've been asking this of a lot of our panels, but I'd like to kick this off by asking, when was the first time that you became aware of disparities? We'll start with Matt.
Disparities. When did I know or recognize disparities existing? It had to have been as a child, and it was through my parents. My father, I was privileged to be exposed to not only the marketplace, but also how professionals, African-American professionals of color, were treated in the corporate setting post civil rights. So in the late 60s and early 70s, my father was in corporate America before becoming an entrepreneur. And he stated his firsthand experiences of disparities in growing up in Oak Cliff. He taught my brother and my sister and myself of those disparities in our position, so that we can provide solutions when we are of age to be able to make impact in society. And so through watching a documentary series, Eyes on the Prize, or reading things of the Civil Rights Acts in 64, 65, and then 66, and just knowing the history, I was exposed to the disparities of me as a Black person who wants to go into a capitalistic system in America.
Yeah, for me, I would say I understood and recognized disparities when I went to college. I'm from North Louisiana originally, a small town called Homer, a rural environment. And so I went to college and I studied economics, and I realized that the opportunities and resources that were afforded to you prior to coming to college had a lot to do with what your collegiate experience was going to look like. I say that, and I'll give you a little bit more of a detailed example. I spent 2008 campaigning for Barack Obama in a very red Louisiana, but really excited about some of the work that he was doing in the country, obviously. And due to my work, I had the opportunity to actually go to the inauguration, where there was a few hurdles with that, right? There was some financing that needed to be provided to take the train, to get the hotel room, and all of those things. And it was in that moment that I realized all of the work that I was doing could be for naught if I didn't have access to economic opportunity. So for me, that's when I truly understood the magnitude of the economic disparities that exist for folks who are not only in LMI communities, but who come from certain racial backgrounds. So that's when it hit me first.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much. And Gabe?
So, like Matt, I experienced disparity and really started to see it as a child. So, my my mother is a retired teacher, but at the time she was a teacher, I was in a single family home, and as we all know, teachers are not paid a lot. And so I started to see there was a very big difference between some of what my classmates were able to do and what we were able to do. But the disparity did not hit me truly until my mom would bring home children on the weekend. And these children were kids that never got picked up from school. And my mother, being an at heart, all about children person, she saw that there were challenges that even we could afford to take on. And that's when the disparities really started to hit me. Some of the kids had not taken baths for the whole week. And so they were not used to this whole concept of taking a bath every day when they were with us until they went back to school on Monday. They were really in shock that we were living what they thought was this very privileged life. And here I was thinking we were living this very poor life. And that's when it started to really settle with me how different things, how many different levels of disparities that there are, and how different my life really was.
Thanks for sharing that. I think that's a great perspective, those different levels. I think a lot of times we say, okay, haves and have nots, and kind of put them in two categories, but I think that's very different levels. And so I think that's a great point. I would love talking about disparities to kind of get some of y'all's perspective on what you've seen during COVID, how some of the disparities in Dallas have maybe widened, and what your involvement looked like during the onset up to now. I know we're still in it. Let's start with Demetra.
You know, when I get questions about the impact of COVID-19, I usually look at it from a few different angles. Now, the angle that I'm usually asked to look at it from is from my professional experience in serving entrepreneurs. But the first thing I noticed as we were going through the early stages of school being out was how blessed I was to be able to stay home with my kids, attempt to work, not do both very well, but attempt to work and assist them with their school learning and things like that, while also being able to earn an income. And I realized that, you know, when you talk about the disparities, I didn't recognize disparities early on in life because you're living with people who are living in very similar circumstances, right? And so it doesn't usually stand out. But when I reflected back, I thought back, my mom would not have been able to do this, right? I would have had a truly, probably a learning loss that far exceeds what we believe the data is going to show us in terms of our children, had she had to go to work and do that. So I always want to just recognize the moms and the dads who had to navigate this period and try to educate their children and still earn an income. With that being said, I'll just speak to a little bit of what I've noticed in terms of entrepreneurship. I think the obvious things, and I think you'll hear it from this group, is number one, the access to capital issue was magnified. It wasn't something that was unveiled because it was already known, rather it was magnified. And so we understood that as PPP and other relief efforts were stood up, everyone did not have equitable access to those things. And I think that's problematic. And I think that issue has been covered enough. But one of the things I think we've all been challenged on is the way that we think about capital, right? I think this moment has challenged us to think about innovation and how we create more alternative sources, because entrepreneurs have shown us in this moment they're resilient. They're willing to do whatever it takes to figure it out. There may be some knowledge gaps that exist around certain resources that need to be prepared prior to accessing capital. I'm just using that as an example, but the willingness is there to correct those things. However, it is not just there to kind of be led along without any hope of resources on the path. So I think one of the things I've learned is if you provide a clear pathway, you help an entrepreneur understand what resources are available and how they tap into those resources, and you put a tangible opportunity in front of them to be able to take advantage of that, it's going to work out for the greater good. But for us to continue to kind of over-educate and over-mentor and not have pathways to resources, that is going to continue to be problematic. But that's been one of my biggest learnings, is that we have the ability. to address that. And I believe it was Dr. King that said, it's now a moment of, do we have the will? It's not the ability and the access to be able to innovate. So I'll stop there, but that's my learning.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks so much for that. We did see a lot with people, especially on our side, of unequal access to even get there, not a relationship with a bank or, you know, different things. So we definitely also saw that. Gabe, I would love to get your perspective on what you've seen over this past year and a half or so.
So at Thomson Reuters, we do have, you know, a large amount of our customers that are small businesses, one shop, two shop people who are running law firms or accounting firms that were challenged during these times, especially if they were minority owned, because then their customers were getting impacted. And so we were able to provide lots of various resources, especially around PPP, but it's challenging if you're not able to have those relationships already in place during times like this. It was you suffering from that lack of relationship and the lack of resources that relationship would have provided you. And so we saw that. Our amazing employees have been doing all things possible to help what we call the primary end customer, because our customers are not the entrepreneurs. Our customers are the ones helping the entrepreneurs, but we were trying to help in any way, shape, and form that we could, and we've actually still tried to do that because, like you said, Taylor, we're not out of it yet. On the flip side, from a community perspective, in my role and working with some of the schools here in the area, it was pretty challenging to see the lack of engagement in school due to the challenges that are going on at home. It is very difficult to get students to engage when there's a lot of chaos happening in the home. People not having jobs anymore. Well, what does that mean? Well, who's ever able to be employed, that's who's going to have to work, no matter if you're supposed to be in school or not, not supposed to be in school. Somebody's got to work, and we saw that happening. I was able to visit 18 of the schools in DISD associated to the PTech program twice in the early winter months, and it was challenging to see, the lack of students in the school due to the pandemic, but then their lack of engagement even virtually. As an employer that was working with the students, we did not get as much traction and interest in the opportunities that we were trying to present because there was a lot of chaos. They were distracted with having to deal with the here right now. I can't concentrate on the future and this opportunity that may be 6 months away when I've got to figure out today. How are we going to survive today? Couple that with the winter storm, and it was extremely difficult. So I will say our community has been hit, to me, twice. I mean, a 1-2 punch with the pandemic and the winter storm, which some people are still
Absolutely. Matt, what was your experience like?
So my experience as as an individual or as an entrepreneur, I want to piggyback on everything that was said by Gabe and Demetra, in terms of access to capital, the differences. It wasn't illuminated; it was exacerbated, if you will. Everyone have known the struggles that small businesses, that entrepreneurs of color have in the current marketplace, and what the actions post, I would say November of 2019, but it was in our country actually March of 2020. We really noticed how our society have not supported the entrepreneur community, and that was apparent in our families. It affected how kids were treated by their parents and by their teachers in education. Mental health was a key factor, an observation not only amongst people but myself as well, where we had to address it. And thirdly, this insular climate I observed has really played a key factor for people who are historically extroverted, extroversion type mindsets. America was an extroverted society pre-COVID, and there had to have been some transition so that we're able to interact in silos, and that was a very interesting, I would say, transition. It would be difficult for me as an extrovert, but people who are entrepreneurs who happen to internalize things seem to be able to process things or survive in a different manner. But every single person have been impacted by this season from my point of view.
Tom, is there anything that you wanted to kind of add on to the great insight they've shared with us so far?
Yeah, the insight has been powerful, and building both on Demetra's word of magnifying and Matt's of exacerbating. From my perspective, I do a lot of work around women in the workplace, and often you're speaking to an audience that may not always see the issue as distinctly as personally I see the issue. In COVID and the data brought it to immediacy. It is the last 18 months. You may disagree with the data or challenge the data from 10, 15 years ago and say it's not as applicable or we're growing. The data with women in the workforce was powerful and difficult to turn away from. Working with small businesses, for me, the impact, when you really listen, was what I'll call the confidence gap. So the small businesses, and particularly the businesses of color, this isn't for me, right? PPP isn't for me. Like I don't like the end result doesn't work out for me. So I'm not going to go on what I view as an effort of trying to secure this money when, historically the answer is no, right? And you can tell me it's different today, but I'm done with you telling me it's different today, right? So I spent time as an attorney, trying to advocate and convince the client that this is a real opportunity. And it's the idea of, I've heard this before, right? That confidence gap, just for me, similar to the data with women in the workplace, our system isn't structured fairly. And this isn't the forum to jump into systemic inequities necessarily, but it's not structured fairly. And for me, working with those small businesses, it was, the immediacy again, right? Here's an opportunity, and they're, just like, no. And to Demetra's point, right? Do we now have the will, and leading on Dr. King, so I'm not going to give Demetra full credit, right? Do we have the will to change this? And it's a bit of a systems change, maybe a systems shift. So again, that was kind of the biggest impact for me.
In 2018, the Urban Institute ranked Dallas dead last in economic inclusivity, and we haven't really inched too far up that list since then. I'd really like to hear your perspectives on where you see the areas of opportunity to close some of these gaps, these economic gaps in Dallas, how we become more economically inclusive, and what the next steps for the corporate community are. Matt, I'll let you take that.
Great deal. So give me the hardball question. That's quite all right. I do want to piggyback on another point from our last question, a factor of COVID and how the insularity, if you will, how everyone were in silos, have not have contributed negatively toward us building an inclusive environment in Dallas specifically. And that's primarily because most people want to, one, care for themselves, care for their families, their businesses, which is a self-preservation thing that is understandable. Unfortunately, the byproduct is if you don't have an existing relationship with someone else or another entity, it's not improved in this season. And Dallas at the time, since 2016, have actively tried to reconcile racially. And it's a long journey. It's a long road. We were nowhere too close to being in a good space before COVID. Once the isolation hit, in my opinion, again, this is only my opinion, we kind of regressed a little bit. Hopefully, conversations like this, a virtual forum like this, so that we can continue those discussions and just the education and information from other perspectives can hopefully get us back in line with improving those talks. But I wanted to state that first, because that played a huge part in us not being able to move further than we could have from 2018.
So I'll say that the inequities, the list is so long, but I will start off by saying here's where we all have to come to some agreement, is that if we continue to be okay with the inequities, then we should continue to understand that we're going to see an uproar in our communities. The next generation is not okay with this. And they are seeing that what they may have been raised to understand and believe, they're challenging that. They're challenging, why can't we all have the same opportunity? So in order for us that are in the shoes, in the seats right now, that have an ability to make the change, if we can start to enact that change, then that'll help them to see the next level of change that they can present. Because we're only going to be able to do so much in this generation, and then be able to carry that over to the next generation. But what we have to all do is agree that there's inequities. And I don't think that that's even started to really. I think that people maybe that's happened. Maybe I haven't, in my leadership position, done everything I can to give fair opportunity. But hey, what do I do now? That's the piece. If we can get people to the, hey, what do I do now? And be willing to educate people to what they can do now, I think that that's where the start the starting block can happen for a lot of people. But I think it's acknowledging. People are still not acknowledging. They're like, hey, let me just check the box on my part. But have you really acknowledged that there's inequity in what you're doing, your practice, and how you're even conducting business?
I just wanted to reemphasize because Gabe said something, and I don't want us to miss out. I don't want us to have an assumption that before COVID, things were decent in our conversations with race and in Dallas. It was not. It is not. And unfortunately, people were taught that either one, it's okay, or time will play itself out, or two, there's been miseducation that the solution to make your business or your life successful is avoiding the race discussion. And that's happened throughout the history of our city, and that's impacting the business ecosystem here. So all of these things we're talking about were unaddressed before COVID. And then once COVID became a part of our lives, we have not figured out how to work again towards it. That's all I wanted to say. Thanks.
But Demetra, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this huge question.
Yeah, I agree with so much that Matt and Gabe have already said and echo it. When Tom was talking, he spoke about how there were people who would look at 10 to 15 years worth of data and say, I don't know, the data's flawed. I don't know if I believe that. I think it's time out for not believing marginalized people about their plight, right? I think that's one of the biggest learnings we have to have, is that certain portions of our country and our city have sold themselves on this idea of, if only a person would do X, Y, or Z, they wouldn't have that circumstance, right? And I would challenge the corporate community. One of the things I recognize about Dallas, it's heralded for its prosperity, right? In terms of the Fortune 500 companies that are here. But the geographic story isn't really told on a national scale. And I think we get away with that, because one of the things you don't know unless you live here is that the prosperity, the economic growth is limited into certain parts of the city. And I say that to say that we have so many studies that unpack that at this point, if you're not really carving out a lane for your organization or your company to participate in the work, I would assume that you're choosing not to. And so I would challenge anyone in corporate America to, number one, check on your employees. Many of you who are leading companies may have some practices internally you may want to look at before looking externally at the community, because I say this as a professional who's worked for various companies and who has, peers who are people of color and are women who have unique challenges in the workplace. I won't even go in on some of the challenges women have with trying to get flexible work schedules to make up for some of the burden or load that they have to carry. But that's another topic. And I think another way that our business community can really be of support right now is we need innovation more than ever right now, right? We've already established what Matt just hinted on is the way it was before was problematic, and we're not going back to it. Gabe spoke about the generation coming up behind us. Listen, they are very clear. They have some core values, and self-care is one of them, and equity is one of them. And I don't believe they're going to compromise. So I think it behooves us all to really challenge ourselves on those fronts. But we need the corporate community. I can say in my space, in my line of work with supporting entrepreneurs, in order for us to adjust or address some of the inequities that we've discussed here today, we need flexibility. The traditional ways of lending, the traditional ways of getting capital to people, they don't work for all. And inclusion means you're bringing new people to the table and bringing new people to the party and asking them to dance. And we can't do that with the way things are currently structured. So corporate dollars, I'm going to speak to your dollars, they go a long way in allowing a little bit more flexibility when it comes to creating solutions to problems.
Yeah.
And can I just add, Taylor, that that this may be, we thought that the incident with George Floyd and the pandemic, all of that culminating to get the attention. But what's happening even more that may get the attention of the industry and the corporations is the Great Resignation. When you don't have the talent, then you're having to rely on some other opportunities that you may have not entertained before. You may be willing to invest in areas that you weren't willing to invest in before, because now you are left with a small set of cards to play, and you are running out of leverage on your old ways and your old techniques. And so this is even better of a time for this message to be heard by executives.
I think that's a great point. We're already seeing, just looking at data and looking at job openings and what people are offering, that this Great Resignation is pressuring people to provide more of the things that, Demetra, you mentioned this younger generation wants. They want those flexible work schedules. They want, to be able to work from home, the option to do that. They want better benefits, and those things matter to them. And we're seeing these companies be pressured because they need employees. It's affecting their bottom line now. So I 100% agree, and we're also seeing that. Tom, I'm going to kick it to you, and then I'm going to open it to the floor to make sure we don't miss any points here, because I know we could talk about this all day long.
Yeah, a few thoughts. One, I want to give credit to Gabe, Demetra, and Matt. The generation that follows and has these core values. I know that Demetra, Matt, and Gabe have those core values. the conversation that Matt had in his home with his dad wasn't public, it was private. And I wasn't in that environment to understand, could it be public? But now the power of Matt, Gabe, and Demetra coming out and making it public allows the next generation to stand on their shoulders. So it's a journey and it's a culmination. So that's powerful. That the willingness to have these conversations and bring it to everyone to listen is what empowers that next step in the journey. To Demetra's point, when you're talking about you have the choice, and Gabe saying, what will you do? Right? Everyone now, if you don't see it, then you're choosing not to look. And I agree that if you want to make that choice, we can have that conversation another day. But when you look, what will you do? What is that next step? Listen to what Demetra, Matt, and Gabe are talking about. And in the last point, and then I do want to open it up, is I love Demetra talking about innovation, but I want to demystify the word innovation. I shouldn't say but, and I want to demystify the word innovation. It just means doing something a little bit differently. And it's very simple. I sit on the advisory board for Tuskegee, and we were having a conversation with some corporations. And the dean of the college said, what do you think the qualifications are for students to then intern? And what do you default to? With GPA, right? That's how we grade. And do they need a minimum 3.25 GPA? And teaching at Paul Quinn, no, it has nothing to do with GPA. If the student is a non-traditional student, they have a child they're caring for at home, they're working a job, and they're going to school, and they carry a 2.5, give me that student every time. So the innovation is not, coming up with a light bulb and Edison and changing the entire way we light our home. It's simple steps of just simply doing it differently. And that's the innovation. So when somebody says, well, I'm not an innovator, yes, you are. Right? Just do what you do differently. Stop and take a look at what you do and analyze, and then make those innovative steps. So listening to, I'm energized. Y'all know me. I don't get all that worked up, right? But listening to Matt, Gabe, and Demetra, that's the next step. So Taylor, I'll kind of kick it back to you, and maybe everybody can share their final thoughts. But again, thank you for sharing today.
Yeah, I want to open it up and just give you an opportunity to, if you have any final thoughts or anything you want to touch on it, I would love to hear it. I'll let you guys start. I'll let you decide.
What Tom was saying about innovation. To me, some of the best innovators are from minority communities because they've had to figure it out. When you're given nothing, you've got to figure out how to make something out of nothing. And we have. And I really appreciate those organizations that have the stories of people who they have really took, quote unquote, the risk. I don't say the risk, I say the ultimate reward, which is actually giving that person a chance. That to be able to survive some of the communities that our amazing talent is in, they could easily dominate a corporation given the other areas that they've come from. They could easily navigate the political waters that are in a lot of companies and organizations because they've had to navigate these. So I just challenge more companies to look beyond people's circumstances and look at the potential. And that is the untapped market that and has been untapped for hundreds of years that corporations need to look more into.
Great comments, Gabe. I agree with you 1,000%. I want to focus my final thoughts on that term innovation that Tom was talking about. And in this space, I want to be a little vulnerable because when there's innovation on one side of the coin, there's progress. But on the other side of innovation, someone who has the historic market share, they feel that there's a decrease, and people are associating a decrease in market share with losing or with the inability to succeed, and that is not an accurate philosophy in terms of making a global, a more equitable global marketplace. Why do I say that as a Black male in this space? Because I am experiencing the norm change now. Black men, at least in the last 50 years, have been beneficiaries of, I mean, not to the same extent as white men in this corporate structure. And as we are innovating, as we are creating equity in the corporate space, and bringing in, me specifically, more Black women entrepreneurs or Black women in spaces that are in leadership, and in general, women in different in all aspects of society, there's innovation that's happening. There's a diversity of thought. And when I, Matt Houston, have been taught that I need to do A, B, C, or engage in this way in order to be successful, and then all of a sudden receive a different blueprint of rules of engagement, I can either say, I reject this and I want to fight this back, I'm going to push against it, or I can read it and say, I have the tools to be able to succeed in this environment too. Let me read that and let's move together. I think most corporations who are used to being successful, who are used to having a strong market share, who have a practice of, we need to dominate in everything that we do, and we have to destroy every competitor. When you have that mindset with human capital, with equity, you're going to fail. And that is the wrong approach, because you're not losing. You have the capabilities to read another blueprint and say, okay, we can innovate. And if I include this 40% of qualified individuals, that can benefit my overall business. I may lose a friend or two. I may lose people who I have close relationships with who are no longer qualified. But that's okay, because society is moving forward. And I think and I will be explicit, until we discuss with systems that were created and controlled by historic white men and their systems, until we address that and figure out how we can all change and alter that system to where all of us can move forward and produce a solid product, I don't think we'll be able to solve this problem in the corporate setting.
Well, first I'll say so much has been said, and I feel like we've covered a lot of ground. I think what intrigues me about this conversation that we're having here now is the idea of having more of it, and not in terms of corporate or businesses talking to community, but community talking to corporate and business. I think so often, with me having a nonprofit background, you're always looking for leaders to put on your advisory board, to put on your fiduciary board, to inform and support your work. But maybe it's time for, as opposed to saying innovation, maybe a paradigm shift, maybe a little bit of a mindset shift to where more businesses invite people from community into their space to inform some of the ways that they're planning on supporting the community in which it does business. So I think I would leave it there in terms of how can we shake up the way we've been doing it, because obviously the way we traditionally approach supporting communities, supporting entrepreneurs from marginalized backgrounds, very little momentum is being gained. If we look at the generational wealth gap and how it has not decreased, I think that tells us a lot about our approach and how we need to do a little bit more. And so I think we should really build on this conversation, Taylor and Tom, that you all have put together and provided this opportunity, and see how we can grow it.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a great note to end it on, guys. I really appreciate y'all joining us today.